The courtroom camera captured a moment so absurd, so perfectly orchestrated for disaster, that it would become the most replayed clip in Judge Judy's 25-year television history. Karen Henderson strutted through those double doors like she was walking into her own coronation, her designer handbag swinging with each confident step, her perfectly highlighted hair bouncing with the kind of energy that screamed entitlement. But it wasn't Karen alone that made this entrance legendary. Behind her, struggling to keep pace while clutching an overstuffed briefcase that looked like it came from a discount store, was the man she introduced to everyone as, my attorney, Michael Bradford. The way she said those words, with such smug satisfaction, such absolute certainty that she had outsmarted the system, would haunt her for the rest of her life. What Karen Henderson didn't know as she settled into the defendant's chair with that infuriating smirk was that Judge Judy had spent the previous evening making phone calls that would expose the biggest courtroom fraud in television history. She didn't know that the single question Judge Judy was preparing to ask would destroy not just her case, but her entire world. She had no idea that in less than 15 minutes, she would be sobbing uncontrollably while her lawyer was being escorted out in handcuffs, facing multiple felony charges that would send him to prison for years. This wasn't just another case about a property dispute. This was about to become a masterclass in what happens when arrogance meets accountability, when fraud meets justice, and when someone stupid enough to bring a fake lawyer into Judge Judy's courtroom learns why that's the worst decision anyone could ever make. Before we dive into the complete and utter destruction of Karen and her fake lawyer, you need to hit that subscribe button right now because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in the justice system. This is the moment when two con artists thought they could outsmart America's toughest judge, and instead walked straight into a trap that had been carefully set from the very first second they entered her courtroom. Trust me, the devastation that's coming will leave you speechless, and you won't want to miss a single second of this epic takedown. Karen Henderson had been terrorizing her neighborhood in suburban Phoenix for 3 years. At 42 years old, she had perfected the art of using the legal system as a weapon against anyone who dared to cross her. Her latest victim was Maria Chen, a 68-year-old retired teacher who lived next door and had made the fatal mistake of politely asking Karen to stop parking her car across Maria's driveway. That simple, reasonable request had triggered a campaign of harassment that would make any reasonable person's blood boil. Karen had responded by building a fence, not on her own property line, but 3 feet into Maria's yard, deliberately blocking access to Maria's garden where she grew vegetables to supplement her fixed income. When Maria protested, Karen had smiled sweetly and said she'd see her in court, confident that her secret weapon would guarantee victory. That secret weapon was Michael Bradford, a man she'd found through a Facebook advertisement that promised professional legal representation at a fraction of traditional lawyer costs. The ad had been clever, deliberately vague, using phrases like legal expertise and courtroom experience, without ever technically claiming he was a licensed attorney. But Karen, blinded by her desire to win at any cost, had seen what she wanted to see. She had paid Michael Bradford $3,500 upfront, a sum that Maria could never afford, which was exactly what Karen was counting on. Bradford had promised her guaranteed victory, claimed he had 15 years of courtroom experience, and assured her that he knew exactly how to handle judges like Judy Scheindlin. He'd spent 2 weeks coaching Karen on what to say, feeding her pseudo-legal terminology that sounded impressive to someone with no actual legal knowledge, and building her confidence to dangerous levels. He'd told her that Judge Judy was just a TV personality, not a real judge anymore, and that her bark was worse than her bite. He'd promised Karen that together, they would not only win the case but humiliate Maria Chen so badly that she'd probably just move away and solve Karen's neighbor problem permanently. What neither of them knew was that Judge Judy Scheindlin had been a family court judge in New York for 25 years before her television career, had presided over more than 20,000 cases, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot liars, frauds, and con artists within 30 seconds of meeting them. The moment Judge Judy's researchers had received the case file and seen that Karen was being represented by someone called Michael Bradford from Bradford Legal Services, red flags had gone up immediately. A quick search of the state bar website showed no attorney by that name licensed in Arizona. An expanded search of all 50 states came up empty. Judge Judy's team had gone deeper, discovering that Michael Bradford ran a business that carefully skirted the line between legal consulting and practicing law without a license. They found his website filled with testimonials from satisfied clients who praised his legal knowledge, his courtroom skills, and his ability to win cases that other lawyers wouldn't take. But nowhere on that website, buried in disclaimers written in tiny font at the bottom of pages most people never read, did it explicitly state that Michael Bradford was a licensed attorney. It said he provided legal services, legal representation, and courtroom advocacy, but the word attorney never appeared except in the phrase, not a substitute for hiring an attorney, hidden where desperate people looking for cheap legal help would never bother to look. Judge Judy had seen this scam before, but never so brazenly walked into her own courtroom. She had made phone calls to the Arizona State Bar, to the district attorney's office, and to 3 other people who had hired Bradford and later discovered he wasn't actually a lawyer. One of those people had lost their house because Bradford's incompetent legal advice had caused them to miss critical filing deadlines. Another had been sanctioned by a judge for submitting documents that Bradford had prepared, documents so poorly written and legally nonsensical that the judge suspected fraud. By the time Karen Henderson and Michael Bradford walked into her courtroom that morning, Judge Judy knew everything. She knew he was a fraud. She knew Karen had paid him $3,500. She knew he'd been running this scam for at least 3 years. And she had already decided that this case would end with both of them facing consequences they never saw coming. The morning of the taping, Karen had posted on Facebook about her upcoming appearance on Judge Judy, bragging to her friends that she had hired a real lawyer who would expose the show as rigged entertainment. She'd included a selfie of herself and Bradford standing outside the studio, both of them smiling confidently, Karen holding up a peace sign like she was heading to a party instead of a courtroom. The comments on that post were filled with her friends encouraging her, telling her to destroy Judge Judy, to show them who's boss, and predicting her viral fame when the episode aired. Karen had responded to every comment, building her confidence higher and higher, never once stopping to wonder why a lawyer charging a fraction of normal rates hadn't asked for any retainer agreement, why he'd never sent her any official documents from a law firm, or why his business card listed a Gmail address instead of a professional domain. She had wanted to believe she'd found a loophole, a way to get professional representation without paying professional prices, and that desire had blinded her to every warning sign screaming that something was very wrong. Michael Bradford had spent the morning before the taping coaching Karen one final time in the studio parking lot. He'd reminded her to let him do most of the talking, to nod seriously when he cited legal precedents that he'd made up, and to maintain an expression of righteous confidence no matter what Judge Judy said. He'd assured her that television judges were limited in what they could actually do, that this was all for entertainment, and that as long as they stuck to the script he'd prepared, they'd walk away with a victory and the $5,000 maximum judgment that Karen was seeking from Maria Chen. What Bradford hadn't told Karen was that he'd failed out of law school after 1 semester, that he'd never taken the bar exam, and that every single case he'd handled over the past 3 years had either been settled out of court by desperate clients who didn't know any better or had resulted in default judgments because his legal filings were so incompetent that judges simply ignored them. He'd been counting on the fact that most people were too embarrassed to admit they'd been scammed, too financially drained to pursue legal action against him, or too ignorant about the law to realize he had no idea what he was doing. He'd gotten away with it dozens of times before, and his arrogance had grown with each successful con. Walking into Judge Judy's courtroom was the single biggest mistake of his criminal career. The case was scheduled as a standard 15-minute segment, but producers had been quietly told to keep the cameras rolling no matter what happened. Judge Judy had informed them that this case might run longer than usual and that what was about to unfold needed to be captured in its entirety. The audience had been seated, a mix of retired folks and daytime TV enthusiasts who'd waited months for tickets to watch their favorite judge in action. They had no idea they were about to witness television history, that the episode they'd watch being taped would be shared over 50 million times across every social media platform within 48 hours of airing. Maria Chen sat in the plaintiff's chair, a small, dignified woman in a simple dress, clutching a folder of documents that proved Karen's fence was illegally built on her property. She looked terrified, intimidated by Karen's expensive clothes and professional representation, convinced that she was about to lose everything because she couldn't afford a real lawyer to defend her rights. Judge Judy entered the courtroom with her signature no-nonsense stride, her black robe flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. The audience stood respectfully, then settled back into their seats as she arranged her papers with the precise movements of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of a predator surveying the landscape. She looked at Maria Chen with a brief nod of acknowledgement, then let her gaze settle on Karen Henderson and the man sitting beside her at the defendant's table. Judge Judy's expression revealed nothing, but everyone who had watched her show for years knew that slight narrowing of her eyes meant she had already formed an opinion, and it wasn't favorable. The bailiff announced the case, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. Case number 4287. Maria Chen vs. Karen Henderson. The plaintiff is suing for $5,000 for the cost of removing an illegally constructed fence and damages to her property. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face as she addressed the plaintiff first. Ms. Chen, tell me in your own words why we're here today. Maria's voice trembled as she began to speak, describing how she'd lived peacefully in her home for 15 years before Karen Henderson moved in next door 3 years ago. She explained how the relationship had started cordially enough, but had deteriorated after she'd asked Karen to stop parking across her driveway. She described coming home from her weekly grocery shopping to find construction workers building a fence that cut directly through her vegetable garden, destroying tomato plants and herb beds she'd been cultivating for years. When she'd confronted Karen, she'd been told that the fence was on Karen's property and that if Maria had a problem with it, she could hire a surveyor to prove otherwise. Maria had done exactly that, spending $800 she could barely afford on a professional survey that confirmed the fence was indeed 3 feet onto her property. When she'd shown Karen the survey results, Karen had laughed in her face and told her to take it to court if she was so sure she was right. Judge Judy listened intently, occasionally making notes, her expression growing colder with each detail of Karen's harassment. When Maria finished, her voice breaking as she described having to give up the garden that had been her pride and joy, Judge Judy turned her attention to the defendant's table. Ms. Henderson, I see you've brought representation with you today. Mr. Bradford, is it? Her tone was neutral, almost pleasant, but anyone familiar with Judge Judy's courtroom style recognized this as the calm before the storm. Michael Bradford stood up with practiced confidence, smoothing his cheap tie and clearing his throat importantly. Yes, Your Honor. Michael Bradford of Bradford Legal Services, representing Ms. Henderson in this matter. He spoke with the kind of affected authority that came from watching too many legal dramas on television, his voice deeper than natural, his posture exaggeratedly professional. Judge Judy's eyebrows raised slightly. Bradford Legal Services. And where is your office located, Mr. Bradford? It seemed like an innocent question, the kind of small talk that might happen before getting to the substance of the case. Bradford's confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. I operate primarily out of the greater Phoenix metropolitan area, Your Honor, though I serve clients throughout Arizona. It was a deliberately vague answer, the kind that sounded specific but actually said nothing. Judge Judy made a note on her pad, then gestured for him to continue. And you're here today to defend your client against Ms. Chen's allegations regarding this fence. Bradford launched into his opening statement with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he was impressing everyone in the room. He spoke about property rights and the importance of homeowners being able to make improvements to their land without harassment from neighbors. He used phrases like, pursuant to applicable statutes, and relevant case law establishes, without ever actually citing any specific statutes or cases. He talked about how Karen Henderson was a respected member of her community who had acted in good faith based on her understanding of the property boundaries. He claimed that the survey Maria had obtained was from a disreputable company known for producing inaccurate results to generate business disputes. Every few sentences, he would glance at Karen, who nodded along enthusiastically, her smug smile growing wider with each pseudo-legal phrase he delivered. Judge Judy let him talk, her expression unchanging, occasionally jotting notes but never interrupting. This was unusual enough that the regular audience members started exchanging glances, sensing that something was off. Normally Judge Judy would have cut off this kind of rambling speech within 30 seconds, but she was letting Bradford hang himself with his own words, giving him enough rope to tie a noose that would destroy both him and his client. When Bradford finally finished his opening statement, clearly pleased with his own performance, Judge Judy leaned forward slightly. Mr. Bradford, that was quite a presentation. Tell me, in your 15 years of legal experience, how many cases have you personally tried? It seemed like a reasonable question, the kind that might be asked to establish credibility. Bradford's confident smile remained fixed on his face, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Well, Your Honor, I've handled numerous cases across various jurisdictions, primarily focused on achieving favorable settlements for my clients rather than proceeding to trial. In my experience, a skilled legal professional can often negotiate outcomes that serve everyone's interests without the need for prolonged litigation. It was another non-answer, a string of impressive-sounding words that avoided the actual question. Judge Judy's slight smile suggested she'd noticed. That's very diplomatic of you, Mr. Bradford. But I asked you a specific question. How many cases have you personally tried in court? The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. Bradford shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his briefcase clutched a little tighter. Your Honor, if we could perhaps focus on the merits of the current case rather than my professional background, I believe we could resolve this matter more efficiently. It was a mistake, and everyone in that courtroom knew it except for Bradford and Karen. You don't deflect Judge Judy's questions. You don't try to control the direction of her courtroom. And you certainly don't suggest that her line of questioning isn't relevant. Judge Judy's expression transformed from mild curiosity to predatory focus in the span of a heartbeat. Her eyes locked onto Michael Bradford with the intensity of a laser beam, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost every trace of pleasantness. Mr. Bradford, I didn't ask you what you thought was efficient. I asked you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. How many cases have you personally tried in a courtroom? The silence that followed was suffocating. Bradford's face had begun to redden, small beads of sweat forming along his hairline despite the cool temperature of the studio. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Your Honor, I believe my track record speaks for itself. My clients have consistently expressed satisfaction with the outcomes I've achieved on their behalf. Judge Judy's hand came down on her desk with a sharp crack that made half the audience jump. That's 3 times now you've avoided answering a simple question. Let me try another one. Where did you attend law school, Mr. Bradford? Karen Henderson's smile had finally begun to fade. She was looking at her lawyer with growing concern, noticing the sweat, the stammering, the way his hands were shaking slightly as he shuffled papers in his briefcase that suddenly seemed very important. This wasn't how she'd imagined this going. Bradford was supposed to be confident, commanding, and impressive. Instead, he looked like a student who hadn't studied for an exam and was desperately trying to bluff his way through. I attended a very prestigious institution, Your Honor, one with a strong focus on practical legal application rather than purely theoretical study. His voice had lost some of its artificial depth, climbing higher with each word. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, that predatory smile playing at the corners of her mouth that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to be absolutely destroyed. A prestigious institution. How interesting. What year were you admitted to the bar, Mr. Bradford? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Bradford's face had gone from red to pale, the color draining so quickly it was visible even to the audience in the back rows. Your Honor, I'm not sure how my credentials are relevant to this case about a property dispute. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even people who had never been in a legal proceeding before knew that a lawyer being asked about their bar admission was absolutely relevant, and refusing to answer was suspicious in the extreme. Karen was now sitting ramrod straight in her chair, her earlier smugness completely evaporated, replaced by dawning horror as she began to realize that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Judge Judy held up one hand, silencing the courtroom instantly. Let me help you out, Mr. Bradford. Your credentials are relevant because I spent yesterday evening making some very interesting phone calls. I contacted the Arizona State Bar Association. Would you like to know what they told me? Bradford's mouth opened but no sound came out. His briefcase slipped from his sweating hands and hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Judy continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. They told me that there is no attorney named Michael Bradford licensed to practice law in the state of Arizona. So I expanded my search. I called the bar associations in California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Texas, thinking perhaps you were licensed in a neighboring state. Nothing. I had my research team search the national database of licensed attorneys. Your name appears exactly nowhere. Karen Henderson let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth as the reality of her situation crashed down on her like a collapsing building. She turned to look at Bradford, her eyes wide with betrayal and rising panic. Michael, tell her. Tell her you're a lawyer. Show her your license. But Bradford was frozen, his face now completely ashen, looking like a man watching his entire world crumble in real time. Judge Judy wasn't finished. She picked up a folder from her desk, the papers inside clearly visible and official looking. I also spoke with the district attorney's office. They were very interested to learn that someone has been practicing law without a license in their jurisdiction. And I spoke with 3 of your former clients, Mr. Bradford, or should I say, 3 of your former victims. People who paid you thousands of dollars for legal representation, only to discover too late that you have no legal training whatsoever. The courtroom exploded in shocked gasps and exclamations. The audience members were on the edge of their seats, some with their hands over their mouths, others leaning forward to catch every word. This had gone from a simple property dispute to criminal fraud unfolding in real time on national television. Judge Judy's voice rose above the chaos. So let me ask you one more time, Mr. Bradford, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer. Are you, or are you not, a licensed attorney? The seconds that followed felt like hours. Michael Bradford stood there, his cheap suit now visibly damp with sweat, his hands trembling, his face a mask of trapped desperation. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that would seal both his and Karen's fate. No, Your Honor. I'm not a licensed attorney. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People were shouting, gasping, some even standing up in their shock. The bailiff moved closer to Bradford, his hand resting on his radio. Karen Henderson let out a wail that could probably be heard in the parking lot, her carefully constructed facade of superiority shattering into a million pieces. She lunged at Bradford, her designer handbag swinging wildly. You told me you were a lawyer. You said you had 15 years of experience. I paid you $3,500. You lying piece of trash. The bailiff had to physically restrain Karen as she screamed at Bradford, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. Bradford just stood there, accepting her fury with the defeated posture of someone who knew there was no way out, no escape from the consequences that were about to rain down on him like a biblical plague. Judge Judy's gavel came down 3 times, sharp cracks that cut through the pandemonium and restored order to her courtroom. Sit down, Ms. Henderson. Right now. Karen collapsed back into her chair, her rage giving way to heaving sobs as the full weight of her situation became clear. She had brought a fake lawyer into Judge Judy's courtroom. She had paid him $3,500 to perpetrate a fraud. And now she was implicated in that fraud on national television, in front of millions of viewers who would watch this episode and remember her name forever. Judge Judy's voice cut through the courtroom like a scalpel through flesh, cold and precise and absolutely merciless. Mr. Bradford, you have been operating a criminal enterprise for at least 3 years, defrauding vulnerable people who came to you for legal help. You charged them attorney fees, you filed documents in court, you represented yourself as having legal expertise you do not possess. That's not just unauthorized practice of law. That's fraud, theft, and criminal impersonation. She turned to the bailiff without breaking her stride. Officer, please detain Mr. Bradford. I'm holding him for the authorities who I believe are waiting outside this courtroom right now. 2 uniformed police officers entered through the side door as if on cue, and they were indeed waiting, their presence confirming that Judge Judy had orchestrated this entire takedown with the precision of a military operation. Bradford's legs seemed to give out as the officers approached, and he had to be held upright as they placed handcuffs on his wrists. The clicking sound of the cuffs locking echoed through the silent courtroom like a death knell. Karen watched in absolute horror as her lawyer, the man she trusted to win her case and humiliate her elderly neighbor, was led away in handcuffs, his head hanging in defeat, his cheap suit rumpled and sweat-stained, his briefcase left abandoned on the courtroom floor like evidence at a crime scene. But Judge Judy wasn't done with Karen Henderson. Not even close. She turned her full attention to the sobbing woman in the defendant's chair, and her expression held no sympathy whatsoever. Ms. Henderson, let's talk about your role in this fraud. Karen's head snapped up, tears streaming down her face, her makeup running in dark streaks that made her look like a melting wax figure. I'm a victim here too. I didn't know he wasn't a real lawyer. He told me he was licensed. I paid him good money. Her voice was high and desperate, the voice of someone drowning and grasping at any lifeline, no matter how flimsy. Judge Judy's expression suggested she was having none of it. Did you verify his bar license? Did you check the state bar website? Did you ask to see any credentials whatsoever? Karen's silence was answer enough. Let me guess. He charged you significantly less than a real attorney would charge, he promised you things that sounded too good to be true, and you didn't ask questions because you liked what he was telling you. You wanted someone who would help you bully your elderly neighbor, someone who would support your illegal fence and your harassment campaign, and you didn't care whether he was actually qualified as long as he gave you what you wanted. The accuracy of Judge Judy's assessment hit Karen like a physical blow. She tried to stammer out a response, but Judge Judy silenced her with a raised hand. I looked into your background too, Ms. Henderson. This isn't your first frivolous lawsuit. You've sued 3 other neighbors over the past 2 years. Small claims cases that you won by default because your neighbors couldn't afford lawyers and didn't show up to court. You've been using the legal system as a weapon to terrorize people in your community, and you thought bringing a fake lawyer to my courtroom would help you continue that pattern. Judge Judy picked up the survey that Maria Chen had submitted as evidence, the professional document that clearly showed Karen's fence was built 3 feet onto Maria's property. This survey is from a reputable company with 40 years of experience. The fence you built is illegal. You knew it was illegal when you built it. You did it deliberately to harass Ms. Chen after she had the audacity to ask you to stop parking across her driveway. And when she proved you were wrong, you paid a con man $3,500 to help you continue your harassment in my courtroom. Karen's sobs had intensified to the point where she could barely breathe, her whole body shaking with the force of her breakdown. The woman who had walked into the courtroom with such confidence, such arrogance, such certainty that she would humiliate her victim on national television, had been reduced to a pathetic, crying mess who would forever be remembered as the woman stupid enough to bring a fake lawyer to Judge Judy's courtroom. Judge Judy's final ruling was swift and devastating, delivered with the finality of an executioner's axe. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $5,000, which represents the cost of removing your illegal fence, repairing the damage to Ms. Chen's property, and compensation for the harassment she has endured. Additionally, Ms. Henderson, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into your potential criminal liability for knowingly working with someone engaged in the unauthorized practice of law. If they determine you knew or should have known that Mr. Bradford was not a licensed attorney, you could face criminal charges as an accessory to fraud. The courtroom erupted in applause. Maria Chen, who had sat quietly through the entire proceeding, collapsed into tears of relief and vindication. After 3 years of harassment, after being bulldozed by her entitled neighbor, after having her garden destroyed and her peace shattered, justice had finally been served in the most spectacular way imaginable. Judge Judy's final words were directed at the camera, speaking to the millions of viewers who would watch this episode. Let this be a lesson to everyone watching. If you're going to hire a lawyer, verify their credentials. It takes 30 seconds to check the State Bar website. And if someone is charging you significantly less than market rates while promising guaranteed victories, that's a red flag the size of Texas. Use your common sense. And to those who think they can use the legal system to bully and harass others, remember that karma has perfect timing, and it always catches up with you eventually. The gavel came down one final time, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot, officially ending the case and sealing Karen Henderson's fate. Within hours of the episode airing, the clip had exploded across every social media platform. The moment when Bradford admitted he wasn't a lawyer, Karen's screaming breakdown, and Judge Judy's devastating takedown were shared over 50 million times. The hashtag #FakeLawyerKaren trended worldwide for 3 days straight. Legal experts used the case as a teaching example in law schools about the importance of verifying credentials and the serious consequences of unauthorized practice of law. News outlets from CNN to Fox News covered the story, interviewing legal ethics professors about how someone like Bradford could operate for 3 years without being caught. Michael Bradford was ultimately charged with 15 counts of fraud, theft, and unauthorized practice of law. His trial revealed that he had defrauded over 20 clients out of more than $65,000, and that several of those clients had lost cases, houses, and custody battles because of his incompetent legal advice. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. Karen Henderson faced her own legal consequences, not just from Judge Judy's ruling but from the Arizona State Bar's investigation into whether she had knowingly participated in Bradford's fraud. While criminal charges were ultimately not filed against her, the $5,000 judgment combined with the loss of the $3,500 she'd paid Bradford essentially bankrupted her. More devastating than the financial cost was the social cost. Her face became synonymous with entitled stupidity. Her neighbors, who had tolerated her harassment for years, now openly celebrated her downfall. She was forced to remove the illegal fence at her own expense, and Maria Chen's garden was restored to its former glory with the help of community volunteers who had seen the episode and wanted to support her. Karen eventually sold her house and moved to another state, but even there, people recognized her from the viral video, and her reputation followed her like a shadow she could never escape. The case became legendary in the annals of courtroom television, studied by communication scholars as the perfect example of how investigative journalism and entertainment can intersect to expose real fraud and deliver real justice. Judge Judy's methodical destruction of Bradford's facade reminded viewers that justice isn't just about legal technicalities, it's about holding people accountable for their actions and protecting vulnerable people from predators who would exploit them. If you loved watching Judge Judy absolutely destroy a fake lawyer and his entitled client, make sure you smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic takedown. Comment below and tell me what you think should happen to people who impersonate lawyers to scam vulnerable victims. Should the penalties be even harsher? And share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that trying to outsmart the system always ends badly, especially when you're stupid enough to try it in Judge Judy's courtroom. The next Karen takedown is coming soon, and trust me, it's going to be even more satisfying than this one.